The land nobody wanted sat at the low end of the Powder River Valley in Wyoming Territory in the summer of 1874, where the ground dipped into a wide, shallow basin that collected every rain and held it longer than any sensible farmer would have liked. The soil there was dark and heavy, the kind that sucked at boot heels and smelled of iron and old leaves. Two creeks fed into it from the north, and what they left behind when the spring floods pulled back was a muddy, reed-fringed pond about the size of a modest barn lot, croaking, humming, and alive with frogs from the first warm week of April straight through to October. He had claimed that low quarter section because it was all that remained unclaimed when they arrived with their wagon, their two mules, and less than $11 between them. She had stood at the edge of the basin on that first evening and looked out at the shimmering water, the cattails bending in the late light, and she had not said a word for a long moment. Then she had set her jaw and said it would do fine. They were 26 and 24 years old. They had come west from Illinois after two bad harvests and a bank that had grown tired of waiting. They carried a Dutch oven, a broadaxe, 3 wool blankets, a packet of turnip seed, a packet of winter wheat, a coil of rope, and the specific, unspoken understanding that they would not be going back. The neighbors, 3 families with claims on the drier ground north and east of the basin, had watched the young couple unload their wagon with a kind of polite, barely concealed amusement. One man, a broad-shouldered farmer from Ohio who had broken 30 good acres already, rode past on his roan horse one morning in early June and reined up at the fence line they had just started to dig. He looked at the pond. He looked at the mud. He listened for a moment to the full, rolling chorus of frogs that rose and fell like a church congregation finding its voice. He said that was a lot of noise for a lot of nothing. She was driving fence posts 20 yards away, and she heard every word. She did not stop swinging the mallet. They built their cabin on a slight rise at the western edge of the basin, where the ground was firm enough for a foundation of stacked limestone. He felled cottonwoods from the creek bank, and she stripped and notched the logs while he dug the root cellar by hand, hauling baskets of clay up the ladder until his shoulders ached like something broken. By the time the first night frost came, they had 4 walls, a sod roof, a functioning door, and a chimney that drew well enough to be called honest. The wheat went in along the upper slope, where the soil drained. The turnips went along the south edge of the pond where the ground stayed moist but not flooded. And the frogs stayed exactly where they had always been. The winter that year was the kind that teaches a person what they are made of. Snow came early and stayed late, piling against the cabin walls until the drifts reached the lower windowsill, and the door had to be forced open each morning with a shoulder and a prayer. They kept the fire burning through every night, taking turns so neither slept more than a few hours at a stretch, feeding cottonwood logs into the stove and listening to the wind work at the roof like something impatient to get inside. The neighbors to the east, a family who had broken sod 2 miles upstream, came by in February to trade. The husband walked the basin property while his wife drank coffee at the rough-hewn table, and when he came back inside, he had that particular look on his face that men carry when they have decided an opinion about another man's choices. He said the pond had frozen solid and asked what use a frozen frog pond was to anyone in January. His wife laughed politely. She poured more coffee and did not answer, because the answer was not yet ready to be given. Spring came in the slow, reluctant way it does in eastern Wyoming Territory, arriving by degrees rather than all at once. The snow retreated from the south-facing slope first, then from around the cabin foundation, then from the garden ground along the upper wheat field. The pond thawed in patches, and within 2 days of open water appearing at the edges, the frogs began to sing again. She stood at the cabin door that first evening, listening to them start up, and she felt something settle inside her chest that the whole winter had kept in suspension. He had read in a periodical passed around the settlement from hand to hand until its pages were soft as cloth, about the practice of keeping pond edges cultivated to attract insects that would in turn attract the creatures that ate them. He had underlined the passage with a charcoal stub. That spring they did not drain the lower ground. Instead, they turned the soft earth at the pond's margin with a short spade, working in a ring around the water, loosening the soil so that beetles and larvae and the small crawling things of the warming season would congregate there. The frogs, emerging slow and blinking from the mud, found the churned bank immediately. Within a week, the chorus at dusk was something that could be heard a quarter-mile distant. Their second neighbor to the west, a man who ran a small cattle operation and considered himself a practical judge of land use, rode past in April and stopped his horse at the fence line. He looked at the pond for a long moment. He asked if they intended to drain it for a second field. She told him they did not. He shook his head the way people do when they have given up trying to understand something, and turned his horse back down the trail. She watched him go, then turned back to the wheat field where the first green shoots were just beginning to push through the dark soil in straight, promising rows. By May, the talk had spread to the feed store in town. She heard it herself on the morning she drove the wagon in for seed nails and a spool of fencing wire. Two men she recognized from the valley's eastern claims were talking near the counter, not quietly enough, about the couple who kept a frog swamp on good wheat ground. One of them called it a waste that would have shamed his grandfather. The other laughed in the way men laugh when they want to seem reasonable but are not. She paid for her things without hurrying, thanked the clerk by name, and drove home without speaking to either of them. He was mending the south fence when she returned, and he read her face before she said a word. She told him what she had heard, and he was quiet for a moment, pulling a strand of wire taut against a post. Then he said that a man who has never watched a frog hunt does not know what a frog is for. She handed him the nails, and that was the end of it between them, which was one of the things she loved most about the way they spoke to each other. June came in dry and bright, and the wheat grew well. He had laid out the rows the previous autumn by stretching cord from stake to stake, measuring with the patience of someone who understood that the first act of a good harvest was a careful alignment in the dirt. The result was a field that struck the eye as almost orderly enough to have been drawn rather than planted. A neighbor riding past on her way to the mill slowed her horse and leaned from the saddle to study it. She said it was fine-looking ground. He thanked her and meant it, because she was a woman who had buried a husband and 2 seasons of ruin and was still working her claim alone, and her opinion of a field was worth having. The pond, meanwhile, had deepened its life. In the evenings after supper, they would sometimes walk the margin together, and in the warm June dark, the sound coming off the water was enormous and layered, a low thrumming under a higher calling, all of it continuous and woven together the way a strong rope is made from separate strands. He had begun to notice that the insects gathering along the churned bank were drawing the frogs outward, not just to the immediate edge, but into the tall grass of the field margin, where they sat motionless and then struck at things too small for him to see. He mentioned this to her one evening. She knelt and studied the grass for a long moment, then stood and said that the field did seem to have fewer beetles on the lower stalks than it had the week before. Neither of them said anything more than that. They were both people who had learned to let an observation rest until it had time to become a fact. The summer moved forward the way good summers do on that land, full of heat and labor and the slow accumulation of something worth protecting. July came in hard and bright, the kind of bright that has no softness in it, the sun sitting high and white over the valley from before 8 in the morning until long past 6 at night. The wheat had grown knee-high and was beginning to throw its heads, and the corn in the lower rows stood stiff and full-leafed, drinking what moisture the irrigation channel brought down from the creek above the bench. She walked the rows most mornings before the heat settled, pressing her thumb against the soil at the base of each plant, reading the ground the way she had learned to read it over 3 seasons on this land. It was not quite dry. It was not quite right. But it was holding. He had extended the pond's eastern berm by 3 feet that week, using a flat spade and his own back, piling the dark mud carefully so the water would not creep into the field margin, but would stay contained and deep. The frogs had responded to the new berm almost immediately, colonizing its outer face in the evenings, sitting in rows along the damp clay like small, patient sentinels. He found this quietly satisfying in a way he did not entirely explain to himself. The neighbor to the south rode past the fence line on a Thursday afternoon while he was tamping the new berm flat. The neighbor pulled up his horse and looked down without dismounting. He said that the smell off that pond carried a quarter-mile on a south wind, which it did sometimes. A rich green smell that was not unpleasant to either of them, but which others seemed to read as failure, as waste, as evidence of poor management. The neighbor said he supposed a man could farm frogs if he had no better plan for his acreage. He straightened and set the spade handle against his hip. He agreed pleasantly that a man could try many things. He did not say more than that. After the neighbor rode on, she came out of the garden and stood beside him looking at the pond, which in the afternoon light was the color of old copper, rippled by the breeze into small, overlapping rings. She asked whether it bothered him, the talk. He considered the question honestly for a moment. He said that what bothered him more was the thought of being wrong, of having spent this effort on something that would amount to nothing. But when he looked at the field margin, at the wheat stems free of the yellow spotting that had touched the Harmon place north of them, and at the lower corn leaves standing clean and unchewed, he thought the observation they had let rest was beginning to become the fact they had waited for. She nodded and pulled a folded piece of paper from her apron pocket. She had been keeping a record, small, careful marks in a column, counting the damaged stalks she found each morning. The number had dropped by nearly half since mid-June. She did not say this proudly. She said it the way she said most important things, quietly, as though the fact itself deserved the room. He asked to see the paper. She handed it over without ceremony, the way a carpenter passes a level to a partner who needs to check the reading for himself. The marks were small and exact, done in pencil, each row dated in her careful hand. He stood reading it in the afternoon warmth, his thumb tracing the column of numbers as they descended through the weeks like a staircase going down toward something solid. 23 damaged stalks on the 17th of June, 19 on the 20th, 14 by the 25th. And then, from the 1st of July forward, single digits, 7, 4, 3, 2. The last entry read 1 with a small question mark beside it. Because she had not been entirely certain the marking on that final stalk was insect damage at all. It might have been wind scald. He folded the paper along its original crease and handed it back. He said that if he had tried to draw a line through those numbers on a surveyor's map, it would have looked like a trail descending cleanly into good country. She tucked it back into her apron pocket and said she intended to keep counting until she was no longer finding anything worth writing down. That evening, he walked the near field alone, just before the light left. The wheat was at shoulder height now, the heads filling out with a density that felt almost like a promise being kept. He walked slowly along the eastern margin, nearest the pond, and he paid attention to the sounds the way a man pays attention to weather when he is thinking ahead. The frogs were loud enough that he felt the sound more than heard it after a while. A kind of low, steady pressure that seemed to come from the ground itself. Here and there, along the edge of the wheat, he could see the pale shapes of moths settling on the stalks. And then, within a few seconds of settling, simply gone. Taken. Cleanly from below or above by something quick and patient. He stood still long enough that a large bullfrog moved past his boot without alarm, purposeful, unhurried, heading somewhere along the base of the wheat stems in the dusk. When he came back to the cabin, she was sewing by the window with the last of the natural light, which was her habit of economy. She asked what he had seen. He said he had seen the arrangement working in the dark the same way it worked in the day, which seemed to him the truest kind of arrangement. She looked up from her work for a moment with something in her expression that was neither surprise nor pride, but closer to a quiet recognition, as though this confirmed something she had already considered and filed away. She said that tomorrow the Harmon boy had been sent to ask whether they would trade labor at the Harmon harvest, for labor returned at theirs come August. He settled into the chair across from her and was quiet a moment. He said that the Harmon field had looked thin when he rode past it on Tuesday. She agreed. She said it had looked thin to her as well, and that the season was still turning. He said that thin fields and thin seasons had a way of finding each other, and that a man who planted shallow and hoped for rain was gambling with borrowed stakes. She did not disagree, but she said it without hardness, the way a person states the shape of a thing rather than passing judgment on it. The Harmon family had come to the valley 2 years after they had, and they had worked hard enough in their fashion. Only their fashion ran toward speed and scale rather than toward patience. She said she thought the Harmon boy was a decent enough young man, and that the offer of labor exchange was honestly meant. He turned it in his mind for a while. Outside the window, the last color was leaving the sky, going from copper to ash in the way it did in June, when the days were long and the light took its time releasing the horizon. He could hear the pond from where he sat. Not loudly, but steadily, the way a clock is present in a room without demanding attention. The frogs had been particularly active the past 3 evenings. He had noticed the wheat on the south edge of the pond had a deeper green to it than the rows further out, and he had been thinking about why that was. She set her sewing down and folded it the way she always folded it, with a precision that was not fussiness but habit, the kind of habit that comes from years of making small things last. She said that if they agreed to send him 2 days of help at the Harmon harvest, they ought to be clear about which 2 days, and that she wanted those days to fall before their own wheat came ripe. He said that was sensible. He said he would go speak to the Harmon boy himself in the morning, rather than sending word back. She rose and moved to the small shelf where they kept the tallying ledger, a narrow book with a cloth cover worn soft at the corners. She ran her finger down the columns for a moment, not reading as much as confirming what she already held in her head. She said they were 14 days from what she estimated as their earliest harvest window, and that the weather had been favorable enough that she thought they might come in a few days ahead of that if it held. He said he thought so too. He said the stalks on the north rows were filling out heavier than he had expected given the dry spell in April, and he had been trying to account for why. She looked at him with that same quiet expression from earlier in the evening. She said she had her own theory about that, and that she would tell him in the morning when she had the light to show him something she had been watching near the waterline. He accepted that without pressing. That was how they had always worked, each carrying a thought to its proper time, before setting it out between them. The lamp burned low. Beyond the window, the valley settled into its dark, and somewhere near the pond the frogs continued their steady, uninterrupted work. She was up before him, which was not unusual in the warmer months when the light came early, and she used the stillness of early morning the way other people used a quiet room to think. He woke to the smell of coffee already made and found her apron on the hook, but her boots gone from the door, which meant she had gone out without him. He pulled on his own boots and followed the worn path toward the pond. She was crouching at the eastern edge of the waterline, where the cattail roots met the soft, exposed mud of the bank. She had a short stick in her hand and was tracing something in the earth, though she stood when she heard him coming and pointed instead of speaking, letting him see it for himself. The mud along the bank was alive with insect casings. Not a few, a long, irregular line of them, shed skins pressed flat into the wet earth, pale and translucent as onion paper. He crouched beside her and studied them. They were the size of large grasshoppers, though the shape of the casings was not quite right for what he knew of the common varieties. She said she had first noticed them nearly 2 weeks earlier, scattered in ones and twos along the northern bank. By the end of last week, the line had extended the full length of the eastern edge. She had counted what she could reach without stepping in and had stopped at 60, and that was only the visible ones. He looked out over the pond. The frogs were quiet now in the daylight, settled into their usual stillness, but the surface was broken in a dozen places by the slow rings of feeding. He could see several of the larger ones stationed along the margin grasses, motionless except for the occasional sharp movement that was too fast to follow. She said she believed the pond was drawing insects to the water's edge in higher numbers than usual, and that the frogs were meeting them there. She said the shell casings suggested something was emerging from the soil nearby, not just passing through. He stood and turned to look back toward the field. From this angle, standing at the low ground near the water, the rows of grain were visible against the morning sky, fuller than any stand he had grown on this land. The north rows especially, the ones he had mentioned the night before, rose thick and even against the pale light. She said quietly that she thought the pond was doing more than they had given it credit for. She did not say it with pride, exactly. She said it the way a person names something they have watched for a long time and finally feel certain enough to speak aloud. He did not answer right away. He stood looking at the rose and then back at the water, and he turned her theory over the way he did with any idea worth keeping, testing its edges. He said he thought she was likely right. He said he also thought they should walk the full perimeter before breakfast and see what else the mud had to tell them. They walked the perimeter together in the early morning quiet, moving slowly through the damp grass at the field's edge. She carried the tin cup she had not finished and let it warm her fingers. He walked with his hands at his sides, eyes moving between the soil and the crop and the pale distance where the sky was still deciding what color to become. The east side of the field was dry by comparison, the way it always was in July. The ground cracked in small plates between the rows. But even here the plants held their color. Even here the stalks stood without the yellow tinge that had taken other fields in the valley, 2 summers running. He crouched twice along this stretch and pressed his fingers into the earth, frowning slightly, not from worry, but from concentration. She stopped where the field cornered and looked back toward the pond. From this far angle, the water was just a low gleam behind the cattail fringe, but she could hear it still, the persistent low song of it, the same sound that had drawn complaints from the aldermans and the Pruitts since April. She thought about those complaints now without anger, only with a kind of tired clarity. People feared noise that they did not understand. People feared land that looked soft and unproductive when they were accustomed to hardness being the measure of worth. He came and stood beside her and followed her gaze back toward the pond. She said the frogs had been thicker last night than any night she could remember since they first came to the land. He said he had noticed it too. He said the sound had pulled him out of sleep near midnight, and he had listened to it from the bed for a while, before it settled back into something he could rest through. She said that was the night the frogs had been loudest, and she believed they were responding to something moving in the soil that neither of them had yet seen. He was quiet for a moment and then said that the northern edge had bothered him since yesterday, and he wanted to look at it again before the sun climbed. They moved there together. The north side of the field bordered the shallow drainage slope that ran down from the ridge, and it was this side that caught the most runoff when the rains came heavy. It was also the side closest to the pond by perhaps 30 yards, close enough that on a still night you could hear individual frogs distinctly, rather than the general chorus. The soil here was darker. The stalks here were the ones she had pointed to the evening before, the tallest and most even in the field. He bent and parted the lower leaves of one plant carefully and looked at the ground beneath. She bent beside him. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then she reached down and turned a small clod of earth with 2 fingers, and they both saw what was moving underneath it. They saw larvae, small, pale, curled against the dark earth like tiny commas, still sluggish in the cool of early morning, but unmistakably present and unmistakably numerous. She turned a second clod and found more. He straightened and walked 6 paces down the row and bent again, parting leaves, pressing 2 fingers into the soil beside a root. More of them there too, not a scattered handful. A colony working its way through the top inch of earth, still too small to have done visible damage above ground, but established enough that another warm week would change that entirely. She stood with her hands on her knees and looked down the length of the row without speaking. He watched her face. She was calculating, he knew, the way she always did when a problem had edges she could measure, sorting what was known from what was still uncertain, finding the boundary between the two. She said quietly that it was not the locusts that had worried her. Not yet. The locusts were wind-carried and could land anywhere. These were soil-borne, something that had been laid before the main flight arrived, possibly weeks before, and had been working quietly beneath the surface while everything above it looked fine. He said that the frogs had known. She did not disagree. She said that frogs feeding at the surface would have sensed the movement rising from below before either of them could have found it by walking the rows. The pond was 40 yards from the center of the field, but the northern edge was 30 from the water, and frogs ranged far from still water when the hunting was good. She had seen them at the base of the stalks herself on 3 separate evenings, and thought nothing of it except that the insects must be thick there, which was true enough. But the real work had been below the surface where she could not see it. He said that they needed to walk every row before the morning heat set the larvae deeper. They did. They moved in parallel lines, he taking the eastern half of the field and she the western, each of them working slowly, bending at intervals, pressing fingers into the earth, reading what they found there. It took the better part of 2 hours. When they met at the southern fence line and compared what each had seen, the picture was uneven. The northern third was the most affected. The central rows showed isolated patches, and the southern portion nearest the wagon ruts appeared almost clean. She said that was the drainage pattern telling them something again. The slope carried more than water. It carried whatever had been in the soil of the ridge above, deposited here over years before they had ever put a seed in the ground. He looked back toward the pond. The surface was still. A single frog sat on the flat stone at the water's edge, motionless in the early light, watching the field the same direction they were. He said he thought the frog knew something they did not, and she did not laugh at the idea. She had stopped laughing at such things months ago, somewhere between the first spring planting and the morning the locusts came. The land had a way of teaching that did not use words. They spent the remainder of that day spreading the old wood fire ash from the winter pile along the northern third, working it into the soil with the flat-tined fork until the gray dust disappeared into the dark earth. It was not a cure. It was an argument made to the soil, a kind of persuasion that she had read about in a letter from her mother's cousin, who farmed bottomland in Illinois. The cousin had written that ash changed what the soil tasted like to larvae, made it hostile ground. Whether that was true or merely hopeful, she could not say for certain. But she had learned that on the frontier, hope applied with a fork was better than none applied at all. 3 of the neighboring families came by the following week, not to mock. They came quietly, hats in hand almost, standing at the field's edge and looking in. Their own ground was bare and pale, the stalks broken or stripped entirely down to brittle stubs that snapped in the dry wind. One of the men, the one who had called the pond a waste of water loud enough for them both to hear it last spring, stood the longest. He did not say anything for a while. Then he asked what they had done differently. She answered honestly. She said they had done very little, and that most of what saved them they had not planted. She gestured toward the pond without naming it, without making any point of it. He looked at the water and at the still rows of green beyond it, and he nodded once slowly as a man does when he is replacing one understanding with another. They offered what they could spare. It was not a large amount. A portion of dried beans, a small measure of grain, the better part of 2 cured hams that had been hanging in the cool back corner of the root cellar since late autumn. She wrapped each bundle herself. He carried them out to the wagons. That evening they sat on the step of their dugout as the sun lowered behind the ridge. The pond was quiet, the way it always was near dusk before the first calls began. Then one voice started, and another answered, and within minutes the whole shallow basin was filled with sound. She leaned her head against his shoulder. He did not say anything. There was nothing that needed saying. The field stood behind them in the last of the good light, row on row, unhurt and full, and the valley around them held the particular kind of silence that only comes after something has been endured together and survived.